History as It Happens, March 22nd, 2022. Slavery and the Constitution.
The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings.
When he was asked why black people were struggling to succeed even after the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts, Martin Luther King Jr. pointed to history, the history of enslavement, chains from which no other group of people had to break free in America. A half-century later, slavery still casts a shadow over race relations and public discourse. That's next when we speak to Alan Taylor as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, as long as race is going to be so powerful in identifying people, in polarizing people in politics, then the history of race in this country is going to be a battleground.
In 1967 at Stanford, Martin Luther King delivered his Other America speech. There was the America where children, as he put it, grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. Black people lived in the other America.
This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily in search for jobs that do not exist.
Some would say you could give that same speech today and not be very far off the mark. A Brookings Institution study in 2020 found that at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family. Nearly 10 times greater. That study's authors pointed to America's history of racial discrimination, beginning with chattel slavery, then on to Jim Crow, redlining, and other more recent forms of racism that prevent blacks from accumulating and passing down wealth. The Federal Reserve Board in 2019 found that the typical white family had 8 times the wealth of the typical black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Hispanic family. Now, there are many studies you can find on this subject with varying statistics, but they all point to the same conclusion. There is a persistent wealth gap between whites and blacks. So, slavery, abolished in 1865. What does it have to do with our current ills? Well, this is the second episode in what will be an occasional series of podcasts about slavery and the Constitution. Part 1 with Joseph Ellis dropped on February 1st, if you want to go back and listen to it. We're going to consider these questions again. Why do we keep returning to the founding, to the document drafted in 1787? For answers, for clues, for evidence to support our arguments about why things are the way they are today, what it means to be an American. Why is it that the original compromises over slavery agreed to in the Constitution seem to overshadow the importance of abolition in modern discourse? As if our history is frozen in time, or as critics of the 1619 Project put it, it's as if a trans-historical white supremacy runs in an unbroken line from past to present. Now, some of the questions I pose here may strike you as silly, even stupid, but they're meant to provoke discussion and understanding. As you know, we've spent a lot of time discussing and debating 1619 and 1776 on this podcast. We're trying something a little different here, going back to fundamentals, if you will. And we're going to pose those questions to Alan Taylor, Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair at the University of Virginia, and author of many outstanding books about early American history. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832. Alan Taylor, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Martin. It's nice to be back.
You know, some years ago, I took in a presentation about the First World War by the historian Christopher Clark. He explained why he had written a book about a subject that had been written about 1 million times. He said, "The subject is old, but the issues are fresh." I think of that quite often, especially when discussing the subject we're going to talk about today. That's got to make your job as a historian exciting. You're not really living in the past, you're living in the present when it comes to an issue like slavery and the Constitution, right?
Well, I think that's generally true of being a historian, particularly in this country, in that so many issues, history gets brought in. And a historian's job is to be an interpreter between the past and the present. We're not just purely describing a past, we're describing a past for the benefit of people who live in the present or are reading and listening in the present.
It helps that U.S. history doesn't go back that far either. A couple of centuries, 2-3 centuries.
Well, it all depends.
Yeah, that's right.
My version of American history goes back to when people crossed the Bering Strait, which was some 20,000 years ago.
Good point. So, Alan Taylor, let's say you and I are on a spaceship. From some distant galaxy, we land on planet Earth, and we see this debate happening in our society about slavery, racism, the importance of the founding when it comes to our present-day problems with racism and racial discrimination. And we ask, what are you arguing about? Slavery was abolished in 1865. Why are you still arguing over what the Constitution originally did or did not say about slavery? It was amended, the 13th Amendment, and abolished after the Civil War. Well, we know why we're still fighting over the past, right? And you just alluded to it. You're supposed to be an interpreter between the past and present. It's your profession. But as far as our society goes, how would you address that? Why this issue continues to confront us, vex us, even divide us?
Well, as long as race is going to be so powerful in identifying people, in polarizing people in politics, then the history of race in this country is going to be a battleground. It's going to remain relevant. And there are such radically different versions of that history that are put forth, not by historians so much, but instead by pundits and politicians. So we can't avoid it as long as we have differences of race in this country.
And we have discussed the 1619 Project before. I spoke to the founder of the 1776 Unites Initiative, which has nothing to do with the Trump Commission. And politicians, of course, are always making allusions to, or I should say illusions about history. This may sound like a ridiculous or obvious question, but it is meant to simply get to the heart of the issue. Does the Constitution still matter what it said or did not say about slavery?
Of course it does. We treat the Constitution in this country with such extraordinary reverence, the vast majority of people do, that it has become almost abstracted from its actual historical context into something that people literally will worship. And so what that Constitution actually said in its origins continues to matter. And there are many people in this country who will argue that we can solve our problems by just recovering the original meaning of the Constitution and following it. And I find that problematic because the original meaning of the Constitution was for a very different society, one in which slavery was normative and legal in most of the states, not just in the South, but also in most of the northern states at that time, 1787. So I think it could be useful for people to just remember what kind of society the United States was in 1787.
And which original meaning are we discussing? Because the founders and the framers disagreed on just about everything, right?
Yeah, that's the point that I would certainly make. There is not a unitary group of founders whom we can go back to and say, they set us on autopilot to greatness and we should just do what they said.
There are problems with going back to our founders for ammunition, to make a point, or just to try to find evidence to argue one side or another. You know, my question to you might sound preposterous to some, especially to a professional historian. You know, does the Constitution still matter when it comes to the issue of slavery? I asked it because of my thought exercise. You know, slavery was abolished in 1865, so what are we still arguing about?
Oh, racial inequality is not gone. And 1865 didn't resolve that question. And as long as there are very powerful inequalities between the races, this is going to remain an issue. The inequalities of race in this country have everything to do with more than 2 centuries of slavery having been imposed upon people on the basis of race.
To what extent can we still blame, if you will, slavery for our problems today? Some people say not at all. Others say it's very much the reason or a reason.
Well, enslaved people were considered worth about $4 billion in the money of 1860. That's a lot of capital. That form of capital was denied wages, denied the opportunity to save any significant amount of money. And that is something that no other group in the United States has had to endure. And so often people will say, well, just look at all the immigrants who arrived here. They had disadvantages and they were able to rise up through the system. Well, none of them had to experience slavery, in which they were treated as forms of property, in which their families were disrupted through sales. So slavery is a unique, distinctive, powerful phenomenon in our history. I don't think it works simply to say that since 1865, Americans have had a meritocracy where race hasn't mattered, because it has mattered.
It took a century to get to multiracial democracy. I don't want anyone to think that I'm ignoring the century after 1865 and the end of the Reconstruction governments. Of course, we also have to talk about what happened in the North. That was not a Garden of Eden when it came to
Certainly
race relations and Jim Crow, etc. And of course,
Yeah.
we're still grappling with some of these issues. So what does the Constitution say about slavery? Because history is not frozen in time. And James Oakes, who has been on my podcasts, argues that right from the beginning, there was an argument about slavery in this country. The Constitution, in his view, was a contested document. It would be wrong to look at it as a pro-slavery document entirely.
Well, it's not entirely one thing or another. That's certainly true. But does it provide very powerful protections for slavery within it? Absolutely, it does. The three key features are the Three-Fifths Clause, which awards congressional seats and therefore electoral college votes in terms of not just the free population of citizens, but also the free population of citizens plus 3/5 of all others, which meant enslaved people. A guarantee that the slave trade could not be interfered with by Congress for 20 years is in there. And most powerfully, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires people living in every state of the Union to assist in the process of retrieving slaves who have escaped from any other state. Without those three features, the Southern delegates would not have signed off on the federal Constitution. So those were essential, and everybody understood they were essential to keep the Union together. And the calculation that was made by most of the delegates, or I would say all of the delegates who signed off on it, was that keeping the Union to number one. And if that meant that you had to make compromises to protect slavery, then you did it in order to preserve the Union. It is also the case, and I suspect Jim would emphasize this, that the delegates cannot bring themselves to use the word slave in the federal Constitution. And they go through all sorts of verbal literary gymnastics to come up with alternatives that everybody understood meant slaves, but so they didn't have to have the word slave or slavery appear anywhere in the document. So yes, there was a discomfort with slavery, most of the delegates felt. But there was also a conviction that almost all of them felt that to preserve the Union, you had to make compromises with slavery in the Constitution.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Sean Willentz's argument in his book, No Property in Man, where he says one reason why the word slavery does not appear anywhere in the Constitution was because the document and the new federal government did not enshrine racial slavery. It did not recognize it as a federal institution, only as a state institution.
Well, I admire Sean a great deal in his work, but I think he's wrong on that. And I think that if you look at when the first Congress met, the discussions that are in there about things such as whether Blacks could come into the United States. Federal law mandated, no, you cannot come in as a free immigrant as a Black person. And this is at a period of time when the federal government is still guaranteeing the right to import enslaved Africans into the United States. One congressman got up and said, quite frankly, we the people does not apply to Blacks. Benjamin Franklin presented a petition on behalf of an anti-slavery society based in Philadelphia, that said, we know what you said about guaranteeing the slave trade for 20 years, but we want you to reconsider that now that you're assembled in Congress. And the vote was overwhelmingly, no, we can't do that. And you don't have any standing because so many of your petitioners are themselves Black. So the great majority of people in Congress, in the first Congress of 1789 to 1791, were quite clear that the Constitution had made a peace with slavery as the price of union.
And some of those Northern congressmen miscalculated, this is a point Joseph Ellis brought up, that the anti-slavery group believed they had the wind at their backs, that slavery was going to die out fairly soon. They did not see the rise of King Cotton. They looked at the end of the transatlantic slave trade coming up in, 1807, 1808, as a major blow against slavery that other countries hadn't yet taken. They were proven wrong about that because you didn't need the slave trade to continue to grow the slave population after a certain point. But there was an anti-slavery impulse from the beginning. Maybe they miscalculated about the course of history, but they were there. We often overlook that.
That's absolutely right. But we also need to keep it in perspective. It's not a large movement. And a fair amount of it is pretty nebulous. It is this wishful thinking that slavery is going to fade away. It's going to not be economic anymore. And therefore, we don't have to do anything right now. We just have to wait. Which is pretty hard on, even if that was true, that's pretty hard on the people who are still held in slavery, that you're willing to wait for a generation or two or three for it to fade away. So, but there were true activists at that period of time, meaning 1787 to 1790. Most of the non-African American people who were quite committed to fighting against slavery were Quakers, and they were willing to make sacrifices and push hard. And then a few people like Benjamin Franklin who are also quite committed to it. But there were pretty much of a small minority, people who are actually making a commitment to work against slavery in some significant way. Now, they're important, and it, I think, undermines the statement that to be critical of slavery is to somehow adopt a presentist position. Benjamin Franklin lived in that time, so he wasn't a presentist.
Would you call them abolitionists? I always thought the abolitionists were the immediatists of the Garrisonian mold later on in the 1820s, 1830s, but some historians say it is fair to call these early anti-slavery, if you want to call them activists or opponents of slavery, they were calling for the abolition of the institution, maybe at a distant date, but they were still calling for its end.
It's true. I mean, we often will make this hard and fast distinction between people who are gradualists or immediatists, as if the immediatists were the only people who were committed to abolition. The immediatist position is, until the Civil War, one which is just really beyond the political pale for the vast majority of Americans. It just seems to be in violation of the Constitution. And that's what Abraham Lincoln said. He said, I don't really see a need of a constitutional amendment to protect slavery in this country because the U.S. Constitution already does that. But he was also willing to go along with an amendment to the Constitution if he thought that would draw the Confederate States back into the Union in 1861. So the immediatists, as important and interesting as they are, have almost no influence. Let me amend that. They play an important role in stirring the pot and getting people to think. But there's a lot more anti-slavery energy on the part of people who are saying, we got to do something. And that something is probably going to have to be gradual. And it might mean containing slavery, keeping it from expanding. It might, for some of them, be linked, as it was for Lincoln, to overseas deportation of freed people.
Voluntary, but yes.
Well, voluntary, yes, but the American Colonization Society and the states where it was strong, like Delaware and Maryland, were pretty good at putting the screws on people to volunteer for this. So it wasn't entirely voluntary. Also
at the founding, the northern states were ending slavery. One did immediately, Massachusetts, I believe, in a court ruling. A couple others did it in their constitution. Most of them did it gradually, but doesn't that matter as we look back on this, to avoid a presentist position and look at it in the context of the late 18th century, early 19th century, in the Atlantic world, in the global world, the fact that any American states were taking steps toward getting rid of this class of property, that's important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we would be talking about a very different history now if those northern states had not committed themselves to gradual emancipation, or if Congress hadn't adopted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which had made it illegal to keep slaves in the future Midwest. Now, there's a lot of violation of that ordinance, but it's put on record by a group that we include in the Founding Fathers, the notion that Congress does have the power to at least restrict the expansion of slavery. And that Northwest Ordinance pre-exists the ratification of the federal Constitution. So all of those things are very important. It meant that when we get to 1861, you had a group of states that had the overwhelming majority of the population in the United States, which had banned slavery. And that process starts during the Revolutionary generation. So yes, it's important.
Coming out of the Constitutional Convention, Southern slaveholders, the slave power, which at that point was not as strong as it would eventually become, they thought that they had given too much away to the North, right? And many Northern delegates to the Constitutional Convention thought the same, that both sides came away feeling, maybe we could have gotten more, but this is a workable compromise. Why does that matter?
One of the funny things about the reverence now for the Constitution that we have is that the people who were the delegates at the convention were mostly kind of disappointed because they all had to make compromises. And compromise is painful. I mean, we certainly find it today. It's very painful to make compromise. And they found it painful then. And they understood that the whole thing was a compromise. James Madison, we call him the father of the Constitution, he was bitterly disappointed in the Constitution that actually emerged from the convention because it was different from what he had initially proposed. Now, there's a lot of overlap between what he wanted and what ends up being actually adopted, but the overlap was not as great as Madison would have liked. So everybody comes out of it feeling that it's not quite what we wanted. Everybody understood that the Union of the States under the Articles of Confederation had reached a crisis point, and that if there was going to be a Union of the States, this was the best thing going. And so after a pretty hard ratification struggle, the great majority of Americans rally around the proposition that it's not what we really wanted, but let's make it work.
So, when it comes to the issue of slavery, the problem that I encounter trying to understand this, there is the issue of what each side, North and South, said the Constitution does or allows, and then what it actually does allow. Maybe I'm getting lost here, trying to identify an objective truth about what the Constitution allows Congress to do to prevent, say, the spread of slavery to the West.
This isn't just you. We're all in this bind. There's a reason why there are so many constitutional lawyers and they're so well employed. Compare the U.S. Constitution to the Constitution of any other country on earth. It's about the shortest one there is. I often admire brevity, but brevity in this Constitution, then an ambiguity in its language, a studied ambiguity, I would say, is in the short term, a stroke of political genius on the part of the people who put it together. They understood that there were areas in which they weren't going to really quite reconcile their own differences. So here's language that we can all buy into, and we can put this before the various state conventions that will ratify this. And people in South Carolina and Massachusetts will interpret this differently. And that's actually probably a pretty good thing if we want to get this ratified. Well, we're left with the results ever since that people can argue. What does the General Welfare Clause say? Or what does it mean? Does it empower the federal government to create a national bank? Or does it empower the federal government to interfere in the interstate trade in slaves? Does it empower the federal government to obstruct slavery in the federal territories?
Well, Alan, what is your view of those arguments that there was a constitutional basis for anti-slavery arguments in the early republic? And that's Sean Wilentz' argument in his book.
Yeah, well, Sean doesn't invent that. He's picking it up from Frederick Douglass, who made that case. And Frederick Douglass, pretty good guy to have on your side. But I would say that Frederick Douglass is probably on a par with Abraham Lincoln as a creative thinker of reading a constitution in a way that is very helpful for his political agenda. William Lloyd Garrison burns the Constitution, says it was compact with hell. Not everybody is on board with what Frederick Douglass is trying to do. I think it's an ingenious political move on the part of Douglass to try to say that it's going to be a losing struggle if you want to fight against the Constitution in this country, given reverence for it. So let's reinvent the Constitution and say that in point of fact, it's on our side. And Douglass isn't the first person to do this. And as I said, Lincoln is doing it as well at the same time, to read this as a document that sustains a national unitary majority, which is, I think, a creative reading of the Constitution. And I can understand why that argument is still appealing to many people who are politically engaged, as Sean is.
Did you like No Property in Man, his book? I'm assuming you read it.
You know, I always learn a lot when I read Sean's works. Doesn't mean that I agree with what he has to say always, just as he doesn't agree with what I have to say.
So are you familiar with this idea called 13therism? That the 13th Amendment didn't end slavery. It actually established a new kind of slavery, convict slavery. 13therism actually is an academic idea. It's not just something that people... I think it's craziness. What are your thoughts on it?
I have to confess I'm not that familiar with it. I have heard it in passing. The 13th Amendment does say, you could say there's a loophole in it because it is still legal, of course, to compel prisoners convicted of crimes to engage in forced labor.
That predated the 13th Amendment, though.
Yes, but there's a dramatic expansion in the conviction of people and putting them to hard labor after 1865. That's where it's coming from. But as bad as that is, I don't want to minimize the people who were railroaded into forced labor for long periods of their life under that kind of system. That does not compare to slavery. Slavery was a total system in which people are bought and sold as commodities, and it is passed intergenerationally. As bad as an extensive system of criminalized forced labor is, it pales compared to what the slave system was before 1865.
It's called the convict lease system that went on until the 20th century, but convict lease or convict slavery affected 1 or 2% of the black population, whereas slavery affected all of, except for the relatively few number of free blacks.
The end of slavery is a big deal.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
Right? We shouldn't trivialize it. And we shouldn't say, well, there are other forms of coerced labor that persist. Yeah, absolutely there are, and they're bad. But the end of slavery matters. And I think we wrestle with this because some people want to come along and say, everything's solved once you've got the 13th and the 14th Amendments. And there's nothing more to talk about. Well, there's a lot to talk about. But to try to get the right balance point to say the end of slavery is a very big deal. It mattered. People fought very hard for it, and they achieved something extremely important. But we don't then have to go and say everything was fine after that.
Another point to make about that is that slavery was different in 1619 than it was in 1700, than it was in 1800 versus 1860, and not just as a matter of time, but also what part of the country are you talking about?
Well, also what sort of work is involved. As you referred to, the creation of cotton plantations on a massive scale after 1793 will greatly intensify the work and suffering of enslaved people. So as bad as slavery was before 1793, it's a hell of a lot worse after that in most of the South.
It's impossible to know how the leaders of the country in the early days might have approached revising the Articles of Confederation, creating the new Constitution, had there already been this massive plantation system. But that's a counter-historical.
It is impossible to know.
So final thoughts, Alan Taylor. Where do we go from here? I often find public discourse to not be very helpful because it often seems to come down to these competing sides. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The 1619 side or the 1776 side, if you know.
Right. You know, I don't have a solution to it. what I do have a sense, and I do a lot of podcasts with people from a variety of perspectives, and I do a lot of public speaking, not so much since the pandemic, but still do quite a bit. And I'm struck in talking with people who are non-academics and who are non-politicians and non-pundits. There are a lot of people who do wish that people of different perspectives would just listen to each other and just try to take on board the perspective of the other side. Just think about it. You don't have to agree with it, but just listen and just show some basic civility and mutual respect. I have my own political views, pretty strongly held, but probably the view that I'm most lashed a hold of right now is that what we could all do that would do the most good would be just to listen, to be honest about your perspective, but without getting angry about it. And if we could just kind of lower the temperature and get out of our own particular silos of information, which I think is a major problem, and why people can engage in the kind of behavior that they did on January 6th, that we'd all be better off. So what Sean and Jim have to say about, the disagreements between the two of them and me is pretty mild stuff. And there are much bigger, angrier arguments over these issues going on outside of the academy and outside of this podcast.
They're not helpful. They're not honest ones.
No.
These arguments just become weapons in our culture wars. So in addition to your suggestion that we need to listen to each other, we also need to read more.
Yeah, well, we need to read more other than Twitter.
That's right. Well, you're not on Twitter.
I try to stay off of Twitter, and I've succeeded, I think, so far.
Well, I've heard you've written some pretty good books. So people who are
they
listening
don't fit onto Twitter's format, however.
That's right, because a history book on Twitter would be quite the long thread. Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia, you're always welcome here. Among the many problems with Twitter is the absence of complexity. Complexity may not be emotionally satisfying. Complexity is difficult, but to grapple with it is to learn. I hope to soon have James Oakes and Sean Wilentz on the podcast to continue our treatment of this subject, slavery and the Constitution. My initial aim was to run one episode per month as part of the ongoing series. The war in Eastern Europe got in the way of those plans, but we will return to it soon. And on that note, on the next episode of History as It Happens, it appears Russia will try to bludgeon Ukraine into submission. Military historian Max Hastings will join us to discuss Putin, nationalism, no-fly zones, and the prospects for peace. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.